Hello everybody, this is Professor Kelly. I'm going to be talking a little bit about exercise number 3, which is about depth of field, and the different kinds of definitions for depth of field. So we will be exploring extended depth of field, which is also called deep depth of field, versus limited depth of field, which is also called shallow depth of field or minimum depth of field. And we'll be experimenting with depth of field by changing apertures and using manual focus. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is directly related to aperture. So first let's talk about aperture. The aperture setting on your camera relates to the size of the lens diaphragm. These are the lens diaphragms. If you look inside your lens, that's what you'll see. It's an iris that opens and closes. The aperture is defined by an F number. You can see the different F numbers here. These are all whole stop apertures, and each one reflects twice as much light, lets in twice as much light as the last. Cutting the light in half, you have half as much light, but if you're moving forward and opening up by one stop, you're getting twice as much light. So here we're looking at whole stop apertures from f1.4, which is the widest opening, all the way to f22, which is the smallest opening. Remember these whole stops because they will appear on a quiz in class when we're talking about camera controls. So a wider aperture, here, f1.4, lets in more light, but depending on what you're focused on, less will be in focus from the point of focus. That's shallow depth of field. So a wider aperture, less of your image is being focused, and this is called shallow depth of field. A smaller aperture, like f22, if you're using a smaller aperture, more of your image is going to be in focus from the point of focus, and this is called extended depth of field. Here's a great reference as a page out of the textbook, and it's a good reminder for all of the whole stop apertures that you're going to have to remember in the text. So here's a good example of how depth of field works, and if you look at this slide, you can see on this side, we have this landscape photograph where lots of things are in focus. Almost everything from what's very close to what's far away is quite focused. So this is an extended depth of field because what the camera is focusing on is very sharp from the point of focus, which is in the middle here, I guess. And you can see this is sharp, and this is sharp as well. So to get extensive depth of field where everything is sharp, choose a small aperture and manually focus on a central area. So in this image here, we're seeing an example of limited depth of field. So you want to select a wide aperture, like f2 or f4, to create a shallow zone of sharpness with a blurred background. So here, the focus point is the bird, and what's in front of the bird, there isn't anything in front of the bird, so nothing is unsharp, but everything behind it is very blurred. So f5.6, if you're very close to this bird, you're going to throw out whatever's behind it, throw out the focus. So these are both great examples of that. Okay, so shallow depth of field is typically an f-stop from f2 to around maybe f7. If a picture has shallow depth of field, typically that means the object in the front is in focus while the background is out of focus, which gives it kind of a blurred effect. So here's f2. You can see that the iris is very much open, and when you're focused on this little monkey, everything else is just going out of focus. So the interesting thing about that is it's bringing a lot more attention to what's important in the picture, and that's the monkey. It's not the fence. So this is still very interesting because it adds color and depth to the image, but this is the most important thing. So an extended or maximum depth of field is typically f16 to a maximum of f30 or f64 or higher. So when a photograph has a deep depth of field or a maximum depth of field or an extended depth of field, those are all three words to say the same thing. The background and the object is usually in focus, allowing the viewer to see both the background and the object in clear detail, and it doesn't have a blur effect. So here The person is not changing anything except the aperture and focusing on the same monkey. And when you're using this aperture of f/22, now suddenly everything is in focus. So that really changes the way you think about what's important in this image. Here it's all about the monkey. Here there's something else, like you really have to pay attention to the detail that also exists in the sharpness of the fence as it converges into the background, and this, sun falling into the trees and the house and so forth. So to get shallow or minimum depth of field, one thing you can do to exaggerate the effect is to separate yourself or your subject from the background. So separate the foreground from the background, give it a lot of distance. And also if you're closer to that subject, so here the photographer can get quite close to this little squirrel and then throwing out the background and making it look blurry. And again, it brings a lot more attention to the main subject, which is the squirrel. So get close to your subject for limited or shallow depth of field, because that will help you exaggerate that effect. You can see that the distance you are away from your subject will make a big difference with how much can be in focus. So here I'm sure that the photographer is very, very close to this flower. So here's an example of extended depth of field. You can see that this is an f-stop of f/22, and that is a very small opening. And when you're focused on probably here the mid-range, you're still getting everything from this plant all the way into the mountains and the river and the sky beyond. So here's another example of extended depth of field, but it's using a slower shutter speed. So when you set your camera on aperture priority, which allows you to select the aperture, if you select a very small aperture like f/22 or f/32 here, your camera will automatically adjust your shutter speed to let in enough light to make a correct exposure. So since your aperture is so small, the shutter speed may be longer to compensate and make a correct exposure. So here you can see that the aperture is f/32 and the shutter speed is 1 second long. And that is why the water is blurred, but everything else from the foreground to the background is very sharp. And these are just beautiful examples of extended depth of field where the photographer is standing on a beach, capturing something close, probably focusing around here and using maybe like f/32 or very small aperture to achieve this amazing kind of focus all the way from the foreground into the infinity and beyond. Same thing with this image. It's not such a beautiful landscape, as maybe you might define it, but it actually is. I think sometimes things like this are more interesting than this because we see so much of this kind of picture. So look for interesting things, don't look for cliche. Look for something that really defines, ideas about looking at all different kinds of landscapes. I love these tires. I think there's so much beauty here in what's in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Here's another image. This is by Sebastião Salgado. Extended depth of field, very extended. He may have stood back from these birds and used a different kind of lens where you can actually zoom into something a little bit farther away and to look at a more compressed space, but everything is sharp here. And I'm sure he used an aperture that was small rather than large to be able to achieve this kind of beautiful illusion of three-dimensional space and the expansiveness of space. Also, the other thing that's really important is that there's some contrast here. These birds, these white birds, are contrasted against this kind of darker background, and that makes them stand out really nicely. I think you'll find that there's things like that in a lot of these pictures. Like if you look at these, there's a really interesting relationship between these shapes that almost look like trees or natural shapes with these mountainous shapes. There's a lot of contrast in these tires, black, deep blacks, bright whites, and that's bringing a lot of attention to like the texture in the tires and so forth. That makes them really interesting to look into the foreground than to look into the expansiveness of the background and this truck and into the sky. So think about that too. I mean, everything doesn't work. You have to think about subjects, that are interesting and that are going to work for the assignment. So here's some examples of the depth of field exercise. You'll need to have 3 sets of 4 images. You'll be uploading them to your project's drive, which I will show you how to do in class. And these are good examples for the assignment because of the placement and distance of the subject to the foreground, middle ground, and background. So the people that chose these to do this assignment, this one I've already mentioned, this works really nicely because of the color of these apples is red, contrasted against these green and yellow kind of colors. And that works really well to create a comparison of one, foreground versus background. Also, the thing that's in the foreground is very close to the foreground, and the photographer is very close to these apples, and then they're looking past the apples into the background. So that works very nicely for all of these images. So here, the photographer is using an aperture that is smaller, and they're focusing on the foreground, and then they're focusing on the background. And there really isn't a lot of difference between these 2 images, and that's because the aperture is so small. These images is very much more obvious, I guess, that the focus has changed, and that is because they're using a very wide aperture, probably f2. And when you do that, when you're focused on the foreground, the background is much more out of focus, and when you're focused on the background, your foreground is much more out of focus. So this is a great example of something that can really work and teach you a lot about those techniques and tools in the camera. So I'm going to challenge you to explore this idea of aperture and shutter speed by doing it yourself and figuring that out. This is another good subject. I think these flags really stand out nicely away from the background. I think, that's partly because of color and also because of the scale and how close the photographer is to these things that are in the foreground versus the things that are in the background. So do experiments with placement and different types of subjects and colors of subjects and textures of subjects and see what you can come up with.